Hello, everyone. So far, we have talked about tablet, float, block, inline, and position properties for CSS layouts. However, CSS has evolved tremendously. I want to show you the Flexbox structure that provides easier flexibility because it's been developed for ease of use. So the Flexbox allows the elements to be automatically adjusted in space depending on the screen size or device. Were you wondering back there, gosh, why isn't the computer doing it for me? Well, here's where that thought comes into play. Because editing the page structure has now become easier. So the basis of the Flexbox feature, it is the optimal placement of elements in the available free space. So Flexbox is basically an easy way to organize items inside of a container. Now, we can talk about the same features such as grid CSS, but we're going to get to that in the next section. I just want to show you how we can see different screen sizes between the Flexbox structure and the grid. So while the grid aims to work on larger screens, I would say that Flexbox can be used for the smaller screens. So here's an excellent graphic so that when we look at the structure, we can talk about a main container that covers everything, and that is called the Flex container. So inside this container, we see the child elements, namely Flex items. So here we can talk about the X and Y axis, and we'll use these to position the items. The X axis is the main axis, and from left to right, the Y axis is also called the cross axis. That goes from top to bottom. All right, so that's the Flexbox and its structure. So now what about the features that Flexbox has to offer? And why don't we look at the code? All right, so here are the features of the Flex container. And here, the features of the Flex items are separated from each other. So first, let's look at the Flex container features. Display, Flex, and inline Flex. So this means that sub-elements gain Flex and inline Flex features. Flex direction. This is where the sorting direction of Flex items is determined. Flex wrap. This will determine how Flex items behave in 2 or more lines. Flex row is used to determine the Flex direction as well as the Flex wrap properties at the same time. First value indicates a Flex direction, and the second value will indicate and include the Flex wrap feature. Justify content determines how Flex items align on the X-axis. Align items determines how Flex items align on the X-axis. And align content is used for vertical alignment of flexible items of 2 or more lines. Flex items properties. Order determines in what order flexible items should be displayed. Flex grow. The box where this feature is given will grow by the value given compared to other items. Flex shrink. The box where this feature is given will shrink by the value given compared to other items. Flex basis is used to determine the optimum size for Flex items. Flex, it allows us to give Flex grow plus Flex shrink and Flex basis features all at the same time. Align self allows flexible box to go out of the default or defined alignment. And sure enough, that is all about the Flexbox structure and features. We touched upon the container and its items and features. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about some of the values that these features can take with some practice. So hopefully you've got a better understanding about the Flexbox structure. We're going to employ it in the next lesson. All right? See you then. Goodbye. Hello again, everyone. So in that last lesson, explained basically what is Flexbox. So now it's time to code in this lesson. So you want to get to it? Good. And that way I'll explain as we go along some of the other features in the code. So our HTML and CSS files are ready in Atom. So let's prepare some boxes. I'm creating a div called Flex Container. So I put a few boxes in it, and we'll make the class names box 1, box 2, box 3. I'll write 1, 2, 3 in them. So now let's shape our boxes. So we'll go to our CSS file. So here, I'll first give border properties for the container. So I'll make it 300 pixels width and 300 pixels height. As the values for our boxes and the background color. Okay, so if we look at what we've done, we will see that our boxes are lined up and down. Now, if we use the display flex feature for the container, our boxes will come in side by side. Look at that. So the inline flex feature can also be used here. And we can compare the differences between the two features, to block and inline block. For now, I'll prefer to use flex. So now we can start applying the features that we talked about in previous lesson gradually. So here I want to show you the flex direction feature for the container. So this feature can take 4 different values. So our first feature is row. Now when we do this, there's no change because this is the feature used by default. And here the flex items are sorted from left to right. So let's have a look. So when we enlarge and shrink the screen, our box automatically grows and shrinks. Now our second feature is row reverse. As we can see here, the boxes are lined up from right to left. Box 1, then 2, then 3 on the far right. Boxes are ordered from top to bottom with the column feature, and sorting from bottom to top with column reverse. Now let's go back to the row property and talk about items properties. We can show items in the order that we want to by placing an order feature into our boxes. For example, we'll get our second box first, then the third box, then the first box. We achieve the ranking that we wanted. So see, we can easily sort the items in whatever order we want. All right, so now let's get into this flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis features. All right, so that'll make the distinction a little bit clearer. So first, let's use this flex grow feature. So I'll set flex grow 1 in our first box. So I didn't set a value for the other boxes, right? So when we look at our box 1, it filled the whole area. So when we give flex grow a value to an element, we'll say grow as usable space. So to get a little bit deeper with the flex grow value, I'll set 1 for 1 box and 2 box, then 2 for 3 box. we have a total of 3 elements here. First box has a flex grow of 1. Second box has a flex grow of 1. And the third box has a flex grow of 2. So the total number of flex grow units will be 4. The available space in the flex container is then going to be divided by 4, and that means it'll be distributed accordingly, all right? Cool. So let's talk about the flex shrink feature. Flex shrink, flex grow, basically they're the same. However, it's related to the content of the flex shrink element. So an element with a flex shrink value of 0 will not shrink even as our page gets smaller. So this is only true if there is no flex grow value on this element. If there is a flex grow value, then the element won't shrink any smaller than its content. So here, when we give the flex shrink value to our first box, there won't be any change. So now let's talk about flex basis, which is a very important feature here. So for this, I want to make some changes to the code. So I will sort the boxes up and down so that we can better understand the changes by going into the HTML file. I'm also starting to edit our CSS file. So here we'll erase the features that we put in earlier and determine the background color and margin value of the boxes. Okay, so our boxes are ready now. So let's specify 100% value with flex basis. And looking at the width of our boxes, they completely cover the screen. Although the screen gets bigger and smaller, the boxes are always 100%, right? So now I'll change the flex basis value to 40% in our first box. As we can see, our first box now covers 40%. So let's see what happens if we give the flex grow value to this box. So again, it covers the entire screen because we said that you can use the existing space with this feature. So now let's give our box 3 a flex basis value of 60%. And then let's give the value of flex shrink. No changes were made because there is no factor to shrink our box side by side. So now I want to show you the flex feature where we will use 3 of these features at the same time. I will write flex for the third box and make the values 0, 1, and auto. Here, the first value is for flex grow, the second value is for flex shrink, and the last value is for flex basis. And what do we see here? Our third box has returned to its original shape because these values are the default values of CSS. That's enough for this lesson. I do believe we're going to continue with these flex features in our next lesson. Hello again, everyone. So in our last lesson, we started talking about Flexbox features, and then we realized, whoa, you can do a lot with these things. So that means we're going to continue with some of these features in this particular lesson. So I've already prepared our HTML file for you. I created a container div and 3 different divs inside, and I added paragraphs into them. And now let's go to our CSS file and start talking about some new features. So first, let's determine our container properties. Let's give display flex and flex direction row. I add border and padding values for the boxes. I'll set flex basis 60% without giving grow and shrink value to our boxes. So when we look at it, we can't see all of our boxes because it didn't fit on one line. If you remember, we said that we can show more than one line using flex wrap. So if we set this feature to be a wrap, we will be able to see all the boxes. When we change the flex basis to 25%, we can see all the boxes in one line. Flex wrap feature will take 3 values. Single line will use no wrap. That's used by default. There's also a wrap reverse feature. So to better understand that, I'll go to the HTML file and write 1, 2, 3 in the boxes. And as we see when we use the wrap reverse, it starts to hide from the last box. So I want to show flex flow without switching to our other features. Now, thanks to this feature, we can use flex direction and flex wrap values all at the same time. The first value is flex direction, and the second value is flex wrap. We can now delete them, and nothing has changed. So let's comment on these changes. Now we can talk about a few more features. So first, I want to make a big box class name is flex container by going to the HTML file and add some boxes to it. So let's style them in our CSS file. I give background and height values to our container. And display flex feature. All right, so now it's time for the items. So I'll give the width and height. Let's make it 50 pixels. And I'll enter background and border values. Let's take a look so far at our work. All right, so now we want to change the position of the boxes. So for this, we'll use the Align Items feature. When we first will do a flex start, we look at nothing changing, right? This feature aligns items up. Now we made center and aligned in the middle. And when we make flex end, it is aligned with the bottom. Doesn't align when we stretch. So the height of the items increases according to the container. This is by default. But when we give the boxes a height value, there is a change. Even if the container size changes here, the items will grow or shrink accordingly. Cool, so now let's talk about another feature, this justify content. So let's make align items center first. Let's say flex start in justify content. All right, so nothing's changed yet. The items are aligned to the left, and that's the default property. When we flex end, the items are aligned right. When we do the center, it aligns with the center. When we say space between, it leaves a gap between them. And as we can see, first item left aligned, last item right aligned. So when we say space around, there are gaps in between. There's also a gap on the sides. So there's a gap in all directions. So when we say space evenly, it aligns so that all the elements are equally spaced. And as you can see, the gaps in between are synchronized. All right, so what do you think? Before your introduction to Flexbox features, we had to make them, well, I would say a little bit more painstakingly, adjusting the padding and the margin versus values and so forth. Mathematical calculations can sometimes be exhausting. However, what happens when you realize that things can be just a little easier? That's why in this lesson, we talked about align items and justify content. And didn't you find that it provides a great way to align the items pretty quickly, too? So, in our next lesson, we will continue with Flexbox features. Goodbye for now. I'll see you soon. Hello again, everybody. So in this lesson, there's still a lot more to talk about when we're talking about Flexbox features. Now, you remember what we did in our last lesson, right? Created a container with a background that's orange, and we had some boxes inside. Talked about the features, how to align the elements. So in this lesson, we're going to continue with some of these features, but I want to show you something cool. We're going to talk about align self. So you remember in our Flex introduction, I mentioned that it is the items feature. So this feature determines how items are aligned on the vertical axis. So let's go to the code and see what we can do. So first I want to change the height of our boxes. So let's make our first box. Let's keep it at 50 pixels. So the second is 75 pixels, and the third is 150 pixels. All right, so here we have 3 boxes, differing sizes. So now let's start putting align self into our boxes. So I'll say flex start for our first box. Nothing changes because this feature already aligns vertically to the start, right? Our box was already above. And the second feature is the center. So when we apply it, our box is centered vertically. And now if we look at the flex end feature in box 2, it is aligned with the bottom. So now let's give the stretch feature to the last box. Nothing changes. However, if we delete the height here, our box is going to fill the container's height. And what do you think? We use the align self feature to align our boxes vertically individually. Now I want to tell you about another feature, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in detail. So this is the align content, and that's used to align our boxes vertically collectively. So let's undo these changes that we made for align self and add a few more boxes in the HTML file. So I think this box will be enough. Yeah, so we've got enough boxes. Now, I'll give the boxes flex bases and flex shrink feature to see our boxes in a few lines. So now I want to give flex wrap feature to sort out our boxes one after another. And that's just what we wanted, right? So let's take a look at what we can do with align content. First, what I'll do is I'll give the flex start feature. Now, as you can see, the boxes were grouped vertically according to the starting point. So now, if we say flex end for align content, the boxes are aligned at the bottom point. Now let's use the center feature. So our boxes are centered vertically. When we use the stretch feature, of course, the boxes are aligned according to the size of the container. All right, so this is the feature that is used by default. And I give you and surrender to you what to do with all the variables for align content. So we went over the Flexbox in pretty good detail, and we talked about all the different features, how they affect each other in practice. We also covered the features for both container and items. Now it's time to whip up a good project using Flexbox. So it's goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Hello again, everyone. So in this lesson, we're going to start a new layout module with you. Now, as I spoke about before, we learned table, float, position, versus for page layout. Finally, we talked about the Flexbox module, and we saw how easy it makes our work, right? However, CSS is developing, and that means that it allows us to prepare more complex designs easily while preparing our web pages. And Grid CSS also allows two-dimensional changes, making our work even easier in page design. So it also allows us to make changes to both rows and in columns. And we could always make one-dimensional changes in Float and Flexbox. Thus, responsive web development has become a whole lot easier with Grid. However, the Grid structure may seem a bit more complex than some of the other modules, when you first have a look at it, but I don't want you to be afraid. What we'll do is we'll be able to prepare more complex pages easier by learning the different finer points of the grid together. All right? So I got you. So let's have a look. So you see here the insight placement with the grid. And grid basically consists of horizontal and vertical grid lines called rows and columns. So by referring to these lines, the placement of the elements that you want to use in your web page shows up on the grid. Now there's some concepts that we'll need to know in the grid before moving on to the coding part. So let's start by learning grid terms. So at first look, let's talk about the grid container and grid item. So actually, it's pretty much the same logic as Flexbox. We have an outer container and child elements inside. Grid container turns the elements it contains into a grid element. Grid line are lines that divide the grid horizontally and vertically. So each grid line gives a number respectively, and it starts numbering from 1. Grid cell. It's the smallest unit of the grid. It's located between 4 grid lines. Grid row. These are structures consisting of horizontal parts. Grid column. They are structures consisting of vertical parts. Grid track. It's used to express the areas between 2 lines. It can be horizontal and vertical, and it's the general term of the grid column or grid row. Grid areas. It's a structure consisting of a many-grid cell. So we know that every grid element is also a grid area. Grid gap. Yep, there are spaces between column or row. So sure enough, that is all about the grid structure and the terms that we will be using. So I know it's a little bit dry at first, but understanding them is going to be that much easier when we move to the code section, believe me. So if you're confused, don't let it bother you. Confusion is the first step to enlightenment. So in the next lesson, we will start with coding. All right, I'll see you there. Goodbye for now. Hello again, everyone. So the last lesson, we got acquainted with the grid layout. Also talked a little bit about grid structure. So in this lesson, we will start coding and see what we can make happen when we practice it. So let's get started. Now, I already created an HTML and CSS files. So I created a container, just like we did in Flexbox, an HTML file. And because we'll talk about different features for different containers and items, just like we did in Flexbox, in the grid. So I also added boxes in a container, and I write inside 1, 2, 3, and 4, etc. I created 9 boxes in total. Okay, so that's the CSS side. I gave border and padding values for container. I also gave background color for boxes. And I gave the same color for all of them. So let's have a look at what we're doing. Yeah, so since the boxes are all the same color, it looks like one single box. But I also created a border for the boxes so that we could see the distinction. And sure enough, the boxes are lined up. So let's see what happens if we go to our CSS file and use the display grid feature. All right, so no changes are showing up yet. When we say only display grid, the block did not affect the view. So we'll need to add other features here. So I want to create columns first. So for this, let's use the grid template columns feature. And I'll make 100 pixels and 200 pixels as values here. And now let's see what happens. So as we can see, two columns were formed. First column is 100 pixels wide. Second column is 200 pixels. So what if I add 300 pixels of new data to this feature? A new 300 pixel wide column has been added. So yeah, we've created columns with this feature. Well, what do we do if we want to create some rows? Here we can use the grid template rows feature. So I'll make the values 100 pixels for the first row, then 200 pixels, and then 300 pixels. So when we look at the changes, our lines are formed according to the values that we gave. So write the grid template feature that we will use these two features at the same time. And here we enter the rows values first. Then we put the slash sign in between. And we write the column values. Now there's no change when we delete the grid template rows and columns features. We said that the grid allows for two-dimensional changes. Now if we enlarge or shrink our screen, there's no change on our page. But we want to see our page responsive, yes? So to do this, let's first use percentage expressions and take a look at that. For instance, I'll just give 25% to all the values. Now when we look at when we enlarge and shrink our screen, sure enough, it is responsive to our page. At this point, I'm going to want to talk about the FR unit that comes with CSS Grid. FR is a flexible unit that allows us to define usable space. So for now, I will use one FR for columns, and I'll look, and sure enough, we have equal and responsive columns. So what happens if I say 3FR for the second column here? It is 3 times bigger than the other columns. So I'll enlarge the screen and shrink, and as you can see, it grows and shrinks at the same rate in the boxes. So this way we can easily manage the usable space just by using the FR unit. So now let's say that there are repeating parts and column values. So 3 columns of 1 FR here again. So instead of writing 1 FR 1 by 1 here, by typing repeat and we open brackets, how many times we repeat, we write it, and we put a comma and write the recurring value. We are looking at this. If we write 4, we have 4 equal columns. So now let's say I want some space between the boxes. And for that, I will use the grid gap feature. And the more space we want, the more space that we give the value. It's just that easy. Now, before we wrap it up here, I want to tell you a little bit about one item feature. So when we look at our boxes, it goes sequential, 1, 2, 3, 4, but let's say that I want box 7 to be first. We can use the order feature for this. Now, you got to remember from Flexbox, correct? Yeah, you were already there, right? So I set the order value for box 7 to 0. And, hey, there's nothing changing. Why? Haha, because 0 is the default value. But let's say if I do -1, it comes to the first place, as you see here. So by using the order feature, we can obtain the order that we want. All right, my friends. Yeah, sure enough. That I think is enough for right now. Wraps it up for me anyway. So today we talked about the grid features, and in our next lesson, we're going to continue with some new features. All right. So goodbye for now. I'll see you next time. All right, welcome back. So last lesson, well, yeah, we talked a little bit about uh, the grid CSS features. We placed our boxes and rows and columns, and we started making changes in 2 dimensions. And then we also talked about the order feature, and that way we can change the order of the grid items. Now, if you do remember, we took our 7th box to the first row, right? Okay, so that gave the order property -1, and our first box became the 7th box. Now I'm going to talk about another feature that we can change the position of our boxes. And we talked about these lines, they're expressed in numbers. So let me just tell you a little bit about what I mean in our example right now. So let's first remove the gaps and see this situation a lot more clearly. All right, so yeah, we can see the lines clearly. And then when we look here, there are 3 rows and 3 columns in total. And if we count the lines one by one, let's say this is the first line, second line, third line, and here's the 4th line. And if we look at the columns, first line, second line, third line, and 4th. So yeah, that makes it a little more clear. So when we look at box between the second and third row, and between the second and third columns, now let's say that I want to, well, put box 1 here. I'll say dot box 1. And that way I specify the location that I want it to take. First, I'll write grid row start. And I give the starting row line, so that'll be 2. Then I write grid row end, and I'll write 3. Right? So I apply the same operations for column start and column end. And then when we save it and look at the changes, well, here's our first box between the lines that we determined. All right, so you're getting the idea. So we can also achieve what we imagine in a couple of more ways. The first is to use the grid row and grid column feature. So we just write grid row and row start value, row end value, and type grid column and column start value, and the column end value. So we can specify 2 properties at once. Oh yeah, that's pretty cool. We can also use the grid area feature for this. So how do we use the grid area feature? Well, you write grid area and colons. First value, row start, after the slash sign, column start and slash row end slash column end. And that's how we can give all 4 features using the one feature. So I'll just make this feature for our box and give the values 2, 2, and 3, 3, respectively. And now we can comment on all of these. And as you can see, it didn't change. That's the convenience of the grid. So you got to realize that what we want happens a lot easier. And I want to point out one more thing here. As you can see, hopefully, we can bring the box wherever we want to. And when we look at the other boxes, they'll continue to line up just as they should. All right, so let's say, I know, you're scratching your head going, I don't want to change my boxes like that? Well, let's say that I want the fourth box to be between the same lines again, but I want the width to come over to here. Wow, how the heck do you do that? Well, let me show you. Give it a start and end line values with grid row and grid column. Or we can give 4 values using the grid area feature. Boom, all in one go. First of all, I'll just write the name of the class that I want to change. So, .box4. And I'm writing the grid area. So I'll give a row start value as the first value between the second and third row lines. So I'm writing 2 and /sign. Then the column start value, so 1. Line and /sign, row end value 3. And /sign, and then finally column end value 3. And sure enough, our box makes the placement that we want. But our first box isn't visible. Why is that? Well, let's have a look just by saying inspect. And look at this. Our first box is under box 4 because we changed the order of our first box with grid area. Remember? Okay, so if we take the comment here, all the boxes are visible when we refresh our page. Now, I want to call your attention to one other thing here. As we can see, we did not add the fourth line, but it was added automatically. How do you explain that? Well, I explain the situation with explicit grid and implicit grid. So for explicit grid, the layout we wrote for the grid. The column and rows are defined in the code, right? But the implicit grid, that's automatically created for tracks other than the written ones. All right, so sure enough, we combine the columns as you can see. And yes, we can combine the lines if we want to as well. Now to see this, let's bring our third box to the end of our 8th box, say box 3, and I'm writing grid area. And I look at the row and column spacing, and yeah, between line 2 and line 4, between 3 and the 4th column lines, and sure enough, there it is. We went to the next line in box 8. So now when we say inspect, we can see that the third box is in the second row combination, and the fourth box is in the second column combination. Now, I want to show you one other thing here, too. Now, sometimes when we're designing our page, we might not want to deal with what row lines or what column lines. Why? So, if we look at the 4 boxes again, the 2 columns are combined. I come to the properties of the 4th box in the CSS file, and I'm writing grid row values. All right, span 2 for grid column. And I'm commenting grid area. I'm refreshing my page, and there's no change because span refers to the grid item. Here we have given 2 grid item fields for grid column. So we can also use it like this. We give the initial value for the grid column here, 1, after that slash, and write span, how many items it contains, so we write 2. So now we can refresh our page the same way, and bingo. That's how span works. So if we look at our page structure, we can see how many changes we can make with, well, very efficient code. That's what I'm talking about when I say the convenience of grid, or what grid gives us in terms of convenience. Now, we're going to continue to make use and learn these features in depth. But for now, this is a lesson that we talked about changing the position of grid items. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about naming grid areas. So I'll see you then. Goodbye for now. Hello again, everyone. So we've been working with you for a few lessons in the world called grid. In the last lesson, we talked about the grid row and grid column properties, and we made changes with grid items. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to create templates by naming them. All right, so let's start with the code. Now let's go back to our basic structure first, undo the changes that we made here for now. And sure enough, our boxes are back to the state that we prepared. So now we will learn the new code grid template areas. So with this feature, we're going to set a name for each box. And when we look here, we have a total of 9 boxes, so we'll give 9 names respectively. I'll write grid template areas in the container class. Then I'll do a double quotation mark and I'll write A, B, C, just, out of convenience. Names are ready for the 3 boxes. Now here we can do a different name convention. For example, the header can be called header. And I'll just choose the letters, just to make it easy. And let's continue giving letters to the other boxes. I'll say D, E, F, and finally I'll say G, H, I, and then I'll finish the naming. So how do we match these names to our boxes? Well, let's first match box 1 with A. So for this, we'll just write grid area in the box 1 class. And then we write the letter A that we want it to match. And then we can do the same for the other 8 boxes by copying what we just wrote, such as box 2, B, box 3, C, box 4, D. And there you go. That's naming for the 9 boxes. So let's see how we can make that easier to meet here. For example, let's say that I want to change boxes 2 and 3. Well, change the place of B and C in the grid template areas. Let me just refresh the page, and box 3 is on the left and box 2 is on the right. We were able to do what we wanted just by replacing the names. Now, let's say that I want our first box to come over here. What do I do there? Well, in this case, it's pretty easy if I just write letter A here. And, okay, good. So, what can you do if we want to extend this box up to here? Yeah, so if we write in this letter, this is where it happens. So now let's add our changed boxes with a new line. That's it. There you go. So as you can see, it's pretty easy. We're able to edit our page structure. We could easily also bring our boxes to a desired location by naming them. And sure enough, my friends, this is the grid structure. And as you can see, we can edit our page structure with very little code. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to continue to talk about these features. So let's continue. Until then, goodbye for now. Alrighty then, welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to continue to talk about these grid features. And this lesson will also talk about aligning some of these items. So of course, we can continue with the changes that we made in the last lesson. Now, first of all, I just want to talk about the Justify Items feature. So this is code. And thanks to this code, the items in the container will be vertically aligned, and they'll take 4 different values: stretch, start, end, and center. So now we can start trying these 4 features here. Now there's no change when we stretch because that's the default value. So let's say start. And as we can see, the boxes are vertical and aligned to the starting point. So the boxes here shrank as much as their contents. Okay? So when we look here, how much gap has occurred in the area where our fourth box is located? Cool. So let's examine our boxes just by saying inspect. So I'm looking at box 7, box 1, box 2, and as you can see, our boxes are aligned to the starting points of their own column. Now, if we say end, the boxes move over to the right. If we say center, as you can see, it's aligned to the midpoint. As simple as that, that's how you align on the vertical axis with justify items. So why don't we have a look at how to align the boxes on the horizontal axis? So again, we'll use the align items code for this. So this code also has 4 features, and we'll write our features and see what'll change. Stretch, of course, is a default value, so nothing changes. But what do you see when you use the start feature? The boxes align upwards. Now here, since the third box is aligned according to its own line, the gap is a little bit more. And when we say end, of course, it's aligned to the bottom point. Now, when we write center, the line was centered. So why don't we give our start property for line items and the end property in justify items and have a look. Look at that, our boxes are aligned to the top and to the right. So, will the grid that allows two-dimensional changes allow us to use these 2 features at the same time? And it is a good question, and I would have to say, of course. The place items feature, that's going to allow us to align both rows and columns at the same time. We'll write place items, and the first value is for align items, and the second is for justify items. And we're looking at the changes. No change. We use 2 features at the same time. Now we use these features for the container and all the boxes were affected. If we want to align for a single grid item, we can use align self, justify self, or place self for this. So let's undo the changes in the container and let's have a look at what's going to happen with these features for our third box. And what do you see? Only our third box has been affected. So what do you think about that? That is grid alignment. And these features are going to come in very handy as we continue. So in our next lesson, we're going to talk about align content and justify content. Now, we're also going to talk about autofill and autofit, which are very important for our grid. So goodbye for now. Welcome back. So we'll continue to talk about grid features, but now let's just finish out the lesson features quickly so that we can prepare a nice web page with you. So why don't we start by aligning tracks, align content and justify content features. You can use them to align when items don't cover the entire container. So to see that in operation, I enter 100px row and column values in the grid template. Also set the height for the container. And sure enough, as we can see, there is a space in the container. So let's get started with align content. Batch aligns inline. This feature takes values of start, end, center, space between, space around, and space evenly. Let's try one by one, beginning with start. No change. It's already the default. And I say end, and as we can see, it's aligned to the bottom. We call this center, and it comes to the middle point. When we say space between, the items left a space between the lines. And when we say space around, look at that, there is a space at the top and the bottom. Equal ranges occur when we say space evenly, so that's cool. So now let's give our same properties with justify content. Now this time our boxes will be aligned vertically. So I'll copy and paste just for ease, and we'll try it one by one. And yeah, you can see the difference right there in the position of the boxes. So that's what the features do. I bet you can extrapolate the rest of them. So let's undo these changes for now, and we'll return to the standard of our page and just want to talk a little bit more about, well, the grid. I want to introduce you to an alternate scenario. So I set one FR for the row in the grid template and repeat 3, 1 FR for the column. And I'll save the changes and refresh our page. And you see how I'm growing and reducing the browser here? Well, the problem is that it doesn't get responsive enough as our page gets smaller and bigger, right? So the grid allows us to build responsive pages without entering any media quark feature. So at this point, I want to introduce you to the autofill and autofit. So first we can write autofill instead of 3 in the repeat. And I'll write 200px instead of 1fr. Now if I'm looking at the changes, I see them immediately. Now when I enlarge and shrink the page, yeah, it's responsive just like you want. Now when we compare that to media query, we just want to write autofill. So if we write min-max instead of 200px, first enter the min value, comma, and then the max value in parentheses. So I'll call min value 200px, max value 1fr. Then when we cut and shrink our page, our boxes change between 200px and 1fr. All right, so you might be thinking, well, isn't it time to use autofit? Sure, I'll just write autofit instead of autofill. And save the changes, refresh the page. And okay, so there's not that much changed. Only autofill fills the row with as many columns as it can fit. So there are gaps on the edge, as we can see. Autofit, however, behaves in an effort to cover all the available areas. So there are no gaps. All right, you can already see that difference. And there you go, that's it. So those are the features of the grid, and it's enough for now. I do, however, want to prepare a project in which we use both Flexbox features and grid features together, and I'm going to do that in the next lesson. So that means that we're going to put together what we've learned into practice, all right? That way we'll understand more clearly what we can do with Flexbox and grid. So it's goodbye for now, and I want to see you in the next lesson. Hello again, everyone. So we've talked about the grid features in the last few lessons with you, and I think that we've learned it thoroughly. We've explained the subject, explain. Now, you know the important features, but with this lesson, I really do want to design a web page where we're going to use the Flex and Grid features, and that way you will get it into your bones. So I've designed a web page that will give us more information about CSS. And sure enough, this is the page we will prepare. Now, we basically divide our page into 3 sections. First part is the header. So when we enter a web page here, this is part of the information that we usually encounter, like about, career, products, contact me, that kind of stuff. Now, in this section, we will create a list with UL tag and use the flex feature. Here, we're going to use the nav tag that comes with HTML5 instead of the div tag for the container. And don't worry about that. We're going to talk more about it while we're preparing our HTML file. So in the second part of this information section, we'll call it, I want to apply a different color. And I thought that we could also put maybe a photo, add a little information. And I do want to have a CSS photo because we explained the grid here, right? So if you want to, we could redirect it to different links. We can redirect you to the pages where you're going to get more information. So it's all about how you want the page set up or what kind of page is requested, right? In Chapter 3, it's enriched visual content. So let's say I want to create a photos album about CSS. I made changes in the dimensions of the photos just for the sake of visual presentation. So I wanted to draw some attention by choosing a nice color in the background. And here, of course, I used grid. And when I enlarge it or I shrink it, you can see that it is indeed responsive. All right, so now I want to show the color codes that we're going to use. If you want to use the same color codes, you can, just play along with me. And I would suggest that because that way you'll see approximately the same color that I'm using. Oh, and also to set things out and increase the contrast a little bit, we can shade each section as well. All right, so we're going to talk about everything in detail in the code section. Bye-bye for now. I'll see you in the next lesson. So welcome back. Now we can start the code part of our project. But first of all, let's prepare our HTML file together. Then we can switch to the CSS file and start the visual section. So I've already created the basic parts of our HTML file. And I'll write grid CSS for my title. And I link the CSS file name with the link tag. Now we can start writing the code in the body section. So when we look at our page, the header comes up first. So there are sections about us, career, our products, and contact me. Now for this section, we will prepare an unordered list with the UL tag. When we press every word here, we're going to want to take up the relevant link. So we can create our list with li tags. Of course, we'll use a tag to go to related links. However, since this is a simple page, we're not going to provide individual links. Just add a # here. So let's repeat this for all of the list elements. All right, so our list is ready. And of course, we're going to need a container here to cover our list. So we usually use the div tag for that. However, we're going to use the nav tag. So just simply say the nav tag defines a set of navigation links. Instead of defining menu fields with a complexity of div class equals ID, this will allow us to define them only between the nav and nav tags. So sure enough, Here we place our list between nav tag and yeah. So you want to back out and see what we're doing? So the first episode is ready. So how simple does that look without making any changes in CSS, right? All right, so now let's start part 2. There's a photograph and a paragraph here. Of course, again, we will add the photo and the paragraph between div tags. And I prepared photos and added them to the file here. I'll just enter this address in the SRC section, just like so. And then I'll add one paragraph. And more articles may have been added here, but you understand the logic, right? Yeah, so let's back out and see what we're doing again. As if we should edit the width of the photo. Okay, so let's fix that right now. So, okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we come to the most beautiful part, part 3. So in this section, we're going to add photos. And like I said earlier, I've downloaded and prepared these photos before. So now let's add the photos with the img tag into the container. And when we look at it, our HTML file is pretty much ready. All right. So now we can start the CSS part. So in our next lesson, that's when we're going to start to color our page. I'll see you then. Goodbye for now. And welcome back. All right, so generally, we've prepared this page together. But now it's time to style our page. So let's just get right to it. So first, let's color the container. Now for this, we can give the background color to our main nav class. And we will use this color for this section, pound E600E6. So our color's fine, but I want to make a shadow, right, to add a little more, depth. Now you remember that we used the box shadow for this, right? We also use the RGB model here. We specify the shade color and, of course, its intensity from all directions. And we say inset to shadow inside the box. So this color and the shade look pretty good. Why don't we just increase the size of the articles here a little? And for this, I give you font size 2EM. And just like that, we've made changes for the main nav class. Now look at this. We're seeing the list elements one by one, but we do have to bring them together. So how are you going to do that? Well, it can be easy when we make the display flex for UL tag. I'll show you. Now, it's going to be better if there are no spots on this sign. So let's say list style none for this. It's a little better now, but the list elements are very close to each other. So if we give a margin for the list, we can solve the problem. And yeah, that's done. It looks much better, right? So now we can get rid of those underlines if we make use of the text decoration none for a tag. Then it's solved. And yeah, so that wraps up giving a little bit of style in this first episode. Now that you look back on it, how easy was it? We created a list, brought the elements side by side using the display flex feature, and we've even given a little color and shading to our box. All right, so that finishes this. In the next part in this section, we're going to begin to shape the container, which we're going to call Flex Container. So we'll give the background color that we set, pound HC1AFF. Now here we can also use the shadow features that we created above and use the display flex feature again. Now, since we want our photographs and practice to be side by side, this is the way to do it. And looking at the changes, it's almost ready in 2 parts. But there is a gap in the view, and we don't want it to be like this. So what are we going to do? All right, so to solve this, we are going to go to the HTML file and prepare a container with all sections. Yeah, stay with me. We move all codes into this div, which we set up as top container class. And let's give display grid feature for the top container in our CSS file. And I'll give auto for grid template row. And the gap is now gone and responsive in our page. Let's change the text of the paragraph here. So let's set Arial to be the font family. Let's change the font size. And yeah, so we've made style changes in 2 parts, and our page is slowly taking shape. So in section 3, the nice web page will be ready when we make the changes that we want. So in our next lesson, we will continue with part 3. All right. See ya next time. Goodbye for now. And welcome again. So we continue to edit our page. In this lesson, we're going to edit the photos. So first of all, I want to give a margin feature for the body tag that I want to make because there shouldn't be any gaps on the edge of our page. Yeah, so the gaps are gone. All right, so now we can start in 3 parts. First of all, let's give container properties that we add photos. And let's start with the background and shadow properties. Give display grid feature. Let's identify one of the most important features here, the grid template. And we can give 1 FR for row and autofit min-max for column. I also enter 200 px and 1 FR for min-max. And I'll want a space between the photos. 20 px would be good for the grid gap. We can also give a padding value. Right, so now when we look at the changes, it wasn't exactly what we wanted, or, well, what I wanted. So let's do a few tutorials on the class name box. So I'll give the value of margin and padding for the box. Also, we can change the background color to whatever you like. And if you want to, we can give the width to be 100% of the photos. That might be what we want. Let's have a look. All right, so we've fooled around with the placement of the photos. We edited their location. We set our page to be responsive, and we got the image the way that we wanted it to be. Oh gosh, you know what? We prepared our page so easily. We talked about many important features in CSS though. You didn't even notice that, did you? You're becoming an expert in no time. So you can keep your CSS information updated by reviewing current information as well as the different projects over in CodePen. You can expand your information by examining a web page yourself and trying to prepare a different version. There's so much to learn when you continue to develop.